And now our host, Stephen Lee Morris.
In 1994, in Cherry Hill, New Jersey, Carol Newlander, the wife of Rabbi Fred Newlander, was found murdered. The charismatic rabbi was in his early 50s at the time, and in the months that followed, evidence emerged that the rabbi had hired a hitman to kill his wife so he could take up with his mistress. The murder became a news story that wrenched apart the Jewish community in Cherry Hill. Fred Newlander is currently 80 years old and serving a life sentence for his role in the killing of his wife. Not quite 30 years later, playwright Matt Schatz, who spent some of his youth in Cherry Hill, premiered his song cycle musical, A Wicked Soul, in Cherry Hill at the Geffen Playhouse about that murder and how a community heals from such a trauma. On hearing that the Geffen Playhouse was developing the musical, the surviving children of Carol and Fred Newlander and the current rabbi of that same congregation essentially pleaded that the theater cease and desist, that the musical treatment of those events would reopen the wounds of a trauma they're still living with. The theater proceeded with the musical anyway, naming as characters the people involved and without abstracting or removing any of the subject matter from the headlines. In a statement, the Geffen Playhouse insisted that its behavior was entirely legal, and the playwright insisted that the musical was not exploitative or predatory, and that it took pains to be sensitive. Critics at the LA Times and at Stage Raw found the treatment of the news events actually to be facile, and the ethics of developing a musical without changing the names or the identities and against the expressed wishes of the living people involved to be ethically dubious. Joining us this week on Animal Farm is Reid Dammann, a partner with Gordon Reese Scully Mansukani in downtown Los Angeles. Reid's specialty is intellectual property rights, and he's here to discuss who actually owns the story of one's lived experiences from both an ethical and a legal perspective. Reid Dammann, welcome to Animal Farm.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
We're talking today about an issue of intellectual property rights and who has a right to their story and who has a right to tell their story and who's a right to tell somebody else's story. And this is based on the production put on by the Geffen Playhouse about a news incident involving a murder in which the incident affected a local Jewish community in Cherry Hill, New Jersey. And on learning that a playwright was making a song cycle musical out of that murder, the family of the deceased and the accused implored the creators not to go forward with this, as did the rabbi, the current rabbi of that synagogue, and they went ahead with it anyway, saying that they had the legal right to do so and they would be as sensitive as possible. We're here today not to litigate that case. I did invite a representative from the Geffen Playhouse in case they did want to litigate it, and they respectfully declined. So I would rather talk about larger issues really affecting playwrights and screenwriters and individuals who live their life. And you say, it's whose life is it anyway? That's the name of a play, but I think it takes on a different meaning in this context. First question, does anybody have a right to their own lived experience, to the story of their life?
The law really is that you don't. The law is that you don't have the rights to your own story. I think there's ways that you can control how that story is written through statutes and other means through litigation. But yeah, largely you do not. And it's surprising, I think, to most people, because you would think that your own unique experience is owned by you, but it is just not.
So you can own a house, but you can't own your narrative.
It's interesting, right? And you can also own the things that you create. You know, you're at home and you're painting a canvas, and you have a copyright as soon as that brush touches the canvas or that pen touches the paper. It's set there right for you in common law. You know, so it works that way. intellectually and under intellectual property. But yeah, unfortunately, you do not. But you do have the right of publicity, in your name, image, likeness, signature, that kind of thing. And other recourses like we were talking about is defamation, whether they're telling that story correctly or not, or is it false? Have they presented you in a false light? So there's ways to control it, but largely you do not have rights to your own story.
But if it's a narrative, of course they're going to say it's false, because that's the purpose of stories. They are inventions. They are fictions. I mean, they don't call them fictions for nothing. So how would defamation theoretically work in a situation?
Well, that's different. Are you talking about fiction or non-fiction? If we're talking about real life stories, it's different than fiction. I mean, if you've come up with an idea for a fictional movie and a script, and you've written it down, you do have rights to that. There are idea rights out there.
Yes.
And that's a whole separate area of law and entertainment. Yeah.
But if you are creating a musical based on a real life story of somebody other than yourself, what rights do they have? A, if the information is not public. B, if the information has been in the news, as it was in this case.
Well, if it's not public, or if it is public?
First, if it's not public.
Yeah, I mean, if it's not public, you have public disclosure of private facts. You're talking about ways in which the individual whose information is being used has recourse, right?
Yes.
So there's public disclosure of private facts. And that's a way to challenge the use of that material.
So it's a privacy argument. It's a privacy
argument. Yeah, it's a right of privacy argument.
Yeah.
So you do have that, like you have right of publicity, and you have privacy, and you have defamation, and those are ways to, control or attack what's being used about your life story.
What are some cases that have gone through the court system that you know of that deal with these issues of where people got offended or affronted, they felt offended that their story was being misused in a creative work that is by definition fiction?
I don't have anything so I was involved in a case a long time ago, maybe about 5 or 6 years ago, where actually a couple cases, person's image was being used on a nationwide advertisement campaign that they did not consent to. In fact, I think it was a picture that was shot by an employer at the time of the employee, and that picture ended up all over the place. And when she found out about it, she was quite distressed. I was on the other side, but that was the facts of that case. And then a case that's very well known is, I think it's a Folgers cup case. They had a model from the 70s or 80s that they had used and paid for an advertising campaign back then. And then fast forward 20 years later, they used the same image. And he came back and said, that's my right of publicity. That's my name. That's my likeness.
What does right of publicity mean?
Well, you have the right to control your name or your image or your signature or your likeness, whatever that is.
Likeness.
So we discussed earlier about the Xbox, I think it's the Madden football game. I'm forgetting the name of it, but they had used particular NCAA stats and uniforms, but no names. I mean, no faces, no anything like that. But the question in that case, and I don't know if I'm remembering it correctly, was, did EA Sports use the likeness of these athletes? And that likeness in that particular circumstance were their stats and their uniform that they were known for wearing for their games. So that was very interesting. I'm not sure how that case turned out, but yeah, these things crop up from time to time.
And you mentioned a case involving Mike Tyson.
Yeah, Mike Tyson came out a couple of days ago, or maybe it was a week ago. He was very livid with the folks over at Hulu for putting together a documentary on his life and not involving him at all. He's had no say in it. So he was very upset about that. So, you know, and we were talking about ethical considerations, right? Or backlash in that particular circumstance. I mean, imagine, you know, the following that Mike Tyson has, and if that gets out, that's not going to make Hulu look all that great.
You could, the counter argument, particularly in the creative fields, is this is, we talk about likeness as a defense and publicity as a defense, but there is it's a free speech issue on their end, right?
It is.
The creators have a right to free speech. Free speech is not a right without restrictions. What are the creative restrictions on free speech by creators legally, not ethically?
Creative restrictions. I mean, I think we talked earlier that I don't know if this is answering your question, but you know, there are restrictions of the First Amendment. You can't yell fire in a crowded theater. I think there's plenty of levels to the type of language that is not protected under the First Amendment, like obscenity, you know, pornography, those kinds of things. That information is not protected. So there are restrictions of the First Amendment. It's not an absolute right.
Mm-hmm. Are there restrictions when you're doing a creative work based on the life of a figure who has been in the news?
Well, so you're talking about a public figure.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. I mean, you know, there's different standards. So we talked about one way, if somebody's story was used and it was incorrectly, or painted somebody in a false light, or there was false and they painted it as fact. I mean, you could go after that company or that individual for a defamatory cause of action, like libel or something like that. There are different standards for people involved, right? So if it's about a public figure, someone who's known, it's injected themselves into the public light, that kind of thing, there's a different standard under defamatory law for a public figure versus a private figure. Private figure, it's, you know, somebody made a story about somebody and maybe they were negligent, right? And they messed up, and it was a false statement of fact, but it was negligent. A reasonable person would have recognized that you would not have used that, or realized that it was not in truth. And if it's a public figure, I think there has to be actual malice behind it, some kind of intent. So it's a higher standard.
It's a higher standard, yeah. Is the definition of a public figure somebody? Well, what is your definition of a public figure? What makes somebody?
Well, I mean, the courts have it is somebody who's, you know, injected themselves into the light, some kind of prominent position, government official, those kinds of things. I think you'd asked in an email somebody who's, you know, I mean, OJ was famous before he had he went to trial, murder trials, but you know, if he wasn't, if he didn't play the NFL, would he be famous after that trial? And the answer is that probably yes. And would he be a public figure? Probably yes. And a closer question would be is Robert Kardashian a public figure? You know, maybe not before the OJ trial, but after the OJ trial, certainly, maybe. So,
what about a religious leader? Is that a public figure who puts themselves on the well, that's a huge public figure. I don't think that would be in question. But a local priest or rabbi or.
Yeah, I mean, there was a case about it was a really important case. It was Jerry Falwell. Do you ever remember? People versus Larry Flint. It's a perfect example.
Yeah,
Jerry Falwell. He was a cartoon, and he painted I think Larry Flint took out an ad in a magazine, and he was doing something in an outhouse, and you know, Jerry Falwell was a public figure in that case.
Yeah, which would give Larry Flint a lot of protection.
More protection than if it was a private figure, but that's an arguable fact, right? It's no clear-cut way to determine a public figure and a private figure, but it's argued.
So that has to. Oh boy, it's really murky, isn't it? It's really murky.
Well, that's why we have a job, right? That's why I have a job. You know, nothing's ever really black and white, right?
Yeah.
I mean, honestly, even the English language can be quite confusing at times, right? You don't really know what everybody means all the time.
If there is an incident swirling around you that has made you the center of news coverage and television coverage for, in the news cycle, which is for a millisecond, and then it goes away, are you now a public figure? Well, I understand that these are judgments that are made and assessments that are made by the court. But nonetheless, would would that set of circumstances lead to a greater inclination towards to define you as a public figure?
Sure. I mean, you're at the forefront of a controversy, right? That could make somebody a public figure. I think there's some case law on that,
Yeah.
right? Whether you do it proactively or not. I mean, or not is kind of the example we're talking about, right? You just become this person that's ahead of this controversy. You become a public figure involuntarily.
Yeah. Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Exactly. And then let's close up on the ethics of this. We've been talking about the law. The ethic. Does your office? I mean, do you grapple with saying, well, this is legal, but this is wrong? This is kind of what happened a lot in the press coverage of this production at the Geffen Playhouse. I don't think anyone accused the Geffen Playhouse of illegality, and they made it very clear that they had legal clearance to do what they did. Nonetheless, I think the phrase that was used repeatedly by numerous journalists was dubiously ethical to develop this musical. Do you have at your company or in your work guideposts about how to define that?
No, not that I'm aware of. I mean, we deal strictly within the bounds of the law. Ethical considerations, that's for each person to make a choice, right? The Geffen Playhouse has to make that decision whether to move forward and to deal with the possible backlash, right? It's just a decision they have to make, and if it affects their bottom line, maybe they change their opinion, or I don't know, or those people that control whether it goes. That's a tough situation. It's a tough decision, but that's not really for us to consider. Our job is to kind of argue the facts and argue the law, and advocate for our clients. Yes,
it's up to theater critics to to argue.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes it's up to society, right? Because at the end of the day, sometimes society governs. At the end of the day, if there's significant backlash on certain issues, some people won't move forward with it. Like, for instance, this Tyson Hulu situation. I mean, maybe there could be a community backlash there, and maybe Hulu pulls the plug or involves Tyson in some degree. Who knows? But it's largely decided by the community.
Yes, because they could suffer on a commercial standpoint, which is why they're doing the documentary to begin with. And so if it stings them in the pocketbook because of a community backlash, I guess those become the guiding principles, which are kind of unfortunate in a world of ethics.
It's strange sometimes how the stinging of the pocketbook really controls sometimes.
Yeah,
it happens.
Reid, Dammann, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
If you enjoy Animal Farm, please support us on Patreon.